Hi, and welcome to the podcast Peace Matters, a podcast that deals with geopolitics and international relations. In light of the upcoming European parliamentary elections, we're holding a series of podcasts dealing with European affairs. My name is Stefanie Fenkert and I'm the director of the International Institute for Peace. The topic of today's discussion is enlargement for peace, and I speak with Milena Mihajlovic. She is the program director of the European Policy Center in Belgrade, and Kristof Bender. He is the deputy chairman of the European Stability Initiative. I hope you find this discussion interesting. Kristof, since we're going to talk about enlargement today, and we also know that the European Union parliamentary elections are upcoming, my question to you would be if you can give us a little bit of the context of the last ideas about enlargement. Why do we talk about enlargement again after 2 decades of what I would call, and many have been called, enlargement fatigue? Right now, obviously, the Russian war against Ukraine plays a role, so we do have this geopolitical component, but it was not always there. So how would you assess enlargement these days in these very, very difficult circumstances?
Well, okay, I mean, clearly the Russian invasion in Ukraine and the subsequent membership applications of Ukraine and Moldova somehow forced the European Union to put enlargement back on the agenda. But I would sort of hold my breath. Until now, I think most of this was rather rhetorics, and we have not really seen all that much in real terms. Of course, yes, there are candidate status to the countries, also to Bosnia, the formal start of negotiations once the last conditions are met, yes, true. But then when we look at the enlargement process as such, the last negotiation chapter, that's the Commission divides the negotiations in 35 areas, they call it chapters. The last one was closed in 2017, in June, with Montenegro. That's 6-7 years ago. And the dynamic, I think, in these terms has not really changed that much. I think what we see is that even skeptics like French President Macron has sort of seen that there is some urgency in the European periphery to do something. And I think that's with his idea of a geopolitical Europe, we have to be strong, and enlargement somehow is the natural thing to do. But then on the other hand, he is still, he cannot really break out of, I think, his previous mindset. And I think this became very clear last May in Bratislava at his speech when he said, the question is not, shall we enlarge? Yes, no, it's not when should it happen, as swiftly as possible. The question is, how do we do it? And it was very clear that he and also his Minister of European Integration at the time, they did not really have an idea how actually this works. And I think behind this is this difficulty of people like him, and he's not alone in this in the European Union, to imagine a European Union with another 5, 6, 7, 8 other members, 7 members of the former Yugoslavia who all have a vote, France also, only 1 vote. I think he has these huge difficulties to imagine how this could actually work. And so I think we are, when we take all the cosmetics away, we are in the same position as before, where we have essentially a vicious circle of a lacking perspective. No one really believes that enlargement or accession to the European Union is possible in the coming years in the accession countries, and the lack of reform. So not very much, I think, is moving.
Thank you, Kristof. Milena, of what you just heard, maybe you can also explain to us a little bit, or to me, why actually the European Union, in your opinion, should enlarge. I mean, you're coming from Belgrade, from Serbia. It's also a candidate country for many years already. We do see many backsliding when it comes to democracy. We do have a difficult political landscape. There are difficult media landscape, freedom of media, all those issues. But nevertheless, I believe that you also think that enlargement still is very, very important. And from your point of view, what would you say, why is enlargement important? On the one hand for the European Union itself, but on the other hand, maybe especially for the region, which is longer on the track, so the 6 so-called Western Balkan countries in southeastern Europe.
Perhaps the easiest way to put this would be to say that these kinds of problems, which you have indicated, problems related to rule of law, democracy, media freedoms, they would and they will be there whether the region is in the EU or whether it is outside of the EU. But participation in the work of the EU institutions, EU membership, does create a different milieu, a different framework in which these kinds of challenges can be tackled. And I would say that while the European Union is struggling with protecting the values, these core fundamental values in its own ranks among its own member states, it cannot and it should not overlook how important it would be to have the countries which are currently on the rims of the European Union participate in the same mechanisms, in the same institutions, and have the same kind of support which its own EU member states are having. So I would not say that these problems are something that is specific to the countries of the Western Balkans or countries that are not members of the EU. We all know what's going on in Hungary. We all know what has been going or what was going on in Poland for a long time. We all know more and more what's going on in Slovakia. More and more information is coming out about what the new government in Slovakia is doing. So democratic institutions are challenged everywhere. They're challenged even in the most stable democracies of the EU. So I would say that enlargement would be actually the best mechanism to help the countries, the candidate countries, the countries which aspire to become members of the EU, to fight the same fights and to have the same possibilities to protect and defend democracy as the EU member states. This doesn't mean, of course, that these countries can become EU members overnight. Of course, that criteria need to be implemented, and the EU should be quite strict about these enlargement conditionalities. But if the EU insists on these problems being something that is preventing the region from entering the EU, while at the same time we see what is going on in some of the EU member states, then I think that the EU itself will not be a credible actor at all. And the fact is, and this is where I come to, those most standard and most frequently cited, quoted reasons to enlarge, when we speak about economy, when we speak about prosperity for the region, when we speak about security, common framework of security. And in the end, it's also about creating a cohesive camp at a time when the world is extremely divided. So I think that it's really in the EU's interest, especially in these times, and this is why this geopolitical imperative is so important. It is really in the EU's interest to have these countries among its own ranks rather than further sliding away towards some non-European, non-democratic, autocratic tendencies.
Kristof, maybe the same question again also to you. Milena already mentioned many things why she thinks that enlargement would also help the region. But what would you say, what would enlarging the European Union especially also bring towards the now existing 27 member states? So what are the real reasons? How could we actually sell it to the population here? Why it is very important, why it is important to enlarge the European Union?
I think for the old ones, it would bring stability. It would consolidate Europe, and I think, especially these days, this is just very important. Just imagine the Baltics, Romania, Bulgaria; they would be out of the European Union these days. We would have. Already we have a lot of problems, but the problems would be really on a very different scale. So I think for the European Union, in this sense, there is a huge incentive, and for the countries, the aspiring members, I think the accession process, if you have a real accession process in the sense that it's very clear that you have it's a meritocratic process where it means that if you really perform, if you work really hard, eventually you will become a member. Then this is a hugely transformative process. I've just been to Romania and in Iași, in the northeast, very close to the border to Moldova. This place has developed extraordinarily over the last 15 years. It's a tech and research and development hub now. No? They have a pretty decent university, they have a regional airport, but this has been growing tremendously. When you look over the border to Moldova, you see the striking difference. And the reason is, I think, very clearly, and this is also what people are very happy to tell you in Iași, that without EU membership and the process that has been leading to this would look very, very, very different today.
If I can just add something to what Kristof said, he mentioned that the accession process should be a transformative process, and that it should actually help the countries transform into future EU member states. This is something that should lie at the core of both the enlargement policy and the accession process, in the way that it is organized through a credible process, merit-based process, which is really based on the values, which is based on the criteria for accession. But at the same time, I think that it is extremely difficult to have such a process, and this is why, I think that this is why actually the enlargement policy has lost this transformative power, because and you mentioned this long, prolonged period of enlargement fatigue and the lack of activity, lack of action on the part of the EU. The process simply is not, or the membership perspective is simply still not credible. And even though, and Kristof mentioned this in the introduction, although we have had not only statements, I would maybe slightly disagree here that it has all been about statements. There have been new proposals, new approaches adopted. The EU just adopted earlier this year a new growth plan for the Western Balkans, where they also pledged 6 billion euros in grants and loans just until the end of 2027. So for a very short period of time, a big financial injection which should actually support and reward reforms in the region. They have also proposed some measures of this so-called gradual integration through different sectors of the single market. So I would say that there are some measures, and that the EU is slowly transposing or translating these words into some actions. But at the same time, you're absolutely right that the credible perspective is still not there. And I think that this can also be seen, for example, in the utter reluctance of member states to support what Charles Michel proposed last year, a target year for the next enlargement. Not even a target year for the enlargement, but a target year for when the EU should be ready to enlarge. And I think that these kinds of failures by the EU to stand firmly and send a really, really strong message of readiness to proceed with enlargement, this is again something that further undermines the credibility. And this is why still in the region, I think not only in the populations, but also in the governments, we have a lot of skepticism as to whether accession is really in the cards for us, whether it will even happen, despite all of those both words and modest actions that are now being undertaken. And I really believe that in addition to introducing some new measures, new mechanisms, new approaches, the EU needs to come together and say in a really unequivocal manner, send the message that it will be ready for the next enlargement, for the next accession by a specific year. This does not mean that it will promise accession to any candidate country by that point in time, but it will signal that it is actually preparing, and that this is something that is, visible on the political horizon. This is the only way that I think that that the EU can actually motivate the reforms and restore this transformative power.
Yeah.
I would like to catch up on that, on this credibility, because I do think it is very, very important. If you look at the process, we see that those countries who have been on track for, or have been granted candidate status for many, many years, like for example, North Macedonia, Montenegro is already long there, Serbia. If you look at now, since nothing had happened in those 2 decades where there was this so-called enlargement fatigue, the European Union lost immensely on credibility, which you mentioned there. Can you maybe explain me why this is the case. I mean, why did we lose so much credibility there? Why did this happen? Why didn't we really stick together and also deliver on the promises? Because we remember that North Macedonia even changed its name. It was blocked for 27 years by Greece due to the so-called name issue. So maybe you can just give us some ideas on why this lack of credibility has been so big in the region, now talking about the Western Balkans, because it is very different when we talk to the new candidates, because they don't know how long the process actually can work.
Well, I think in the earlier, let's say the Big Bang enlargement 2004, but also Bulgaria, Croatia, you had a process where essentially, there was a candidate country and then there was a process and it started. And I mean, there were also issues. There were also bilateral issues. Let's not pretend that this was always smooth and that everything was basically
Slovenia and
finished
Croatia
in 2002.
had their problems.
But to have the Big Bang enlargement 2004 was far from a foregone conclusion. There needed a lot of skills, and the Danes, I think, deserve a lot of credit for this, to pull this all together. But still, Croatia, which was the country which it took longest, negotiated from the opening to the closing, it was 68 months, right? And what we have been doing afterwards, after sort of the will to enlarge also among the old member states sort of slowly dissipated and vanished, was we inserted, or they inserted, just additional, possible stepping stones where countries could be blocked. And it had became more and more cumbersome. Now we have, in 2022 was the decision kind of to open negotiations with Macedonia and Albania, yeah? But there's not a single negotiation chapter opened yet, because we have made it so cumbersome and so difficult. And of course everyone
and fragmented,
knows,
so fragmented.
Exactly. And now you have to cluster, so you cannot really move on anything. And with Montenegro already it started that you had to have with rule of law chapters first. So you made it, and there is no reason, I think, why should actually, the guys in the agriculture ministry or in the transport ministry wait for the rule of law issues to be solved before starting to work. This is a hugely ambitious thing. You need really kind of every boot sort of on the ground in the administration, particularly of small countries, to actually achieve this. And so I think we need to support them. But what we have been doing over the last 10 years at least is basically slowing them down at every possibility. And I think, everyone has watched Macedonia. Kosovo visa liberalization is another thing. They were late, far behind all the others. The Commission said in 2018 they have met all criteria, and it took another 5.5 years for them to really benefit from it now with the start of 2024. But I think and yes, the growth plan and so on, but I think it's again a way of, addressing this somehow, but not really. Yeah?
Not really. Yeah.
And I think what we need some honesty, because I think if we boil it down to one thing, the key problem is that we promise something which we cannot deliver. Not speaking about the candidates, speaking about the European Union. We say, or we claim, and we do it again and again, that this is a meritocratic process, that countries move depending on how well they reform. And this is just not true. We just look at the assessments of the European Commission. North Macedonia is as prepared as Serbia, nearly as prepared as Montenegro, and they have not even opened a single chapter. Montenegro has opened all the chapters. Now, if finally they would now open chapters, would that mean that they would open all the, 23 chapters where they are as prepared as Montenegro or even better prepared?
Which would be fair.
Which would be fair, if it's a meritocratic process. Well, ask people in the capitals. So I think we need to be honest and say, okay, I think the reason for this is that we have several member states who just cannot imagine an enlarged community or union with the current structures we have. So this means this is something which doesn't depend on candidates and on reforms in these countries, but it depends on us. And everyone who deals with this a bit knows that this is hugely difficult, and no one actually knows when this is going to happen, and actually no one even knows if it's ever going to happen. Yeah. So I think what would be really great is to say, okay, listen, we want you to be members of the European Union. We cannot now promise that when you are ready, we will be ready too. We cannot, because maybe we have not found consensus until then. But we need to promise something instead. And I think one kind of attractive goal which then countries can achieve on their merit and not depending on other EU countries who, I don't know, want to slow the process down because they don't reach consensus on this issue. And that could be single market membership. You essentially would essentially single market membership means that you have access to all the 4 freedoms, goods, capital, services, workforce, and and I think what they would also need would be access to European Union funds. Now,
I was waiting for Kristof to mention this.
Let me just finish this just quickly. And I think in terms of the substance, for citizens, for companies, that would essentially mean more or less the same benefits as citizens and companies of EU member states have. But what would not, people would not sit, politicians would not sit in the decision-making tables in Brussels for the time being until they become full members. But I think this is something where we would take out all these problems of vetoes, because we could just, at the beginning, it would require 2 decisions essentially. One decision to say we offer this, and at the very, very end, after years after years, the Commission monitors, and then if we say, I know, all the countries need good level of preparation, at least in all of these negotiation areas, then there would be, of course, a political decision to let them in. But it would be a dramatic change to what we have now, where we have every EU member state who can basically, at every single step and corner, can say, stop, 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 stop.
I'm curious, Milena, about
this is one point where I have to disagree, and I think that this is because I come from Serbia, and I know that at least at this point in the Serbian establishment, in the Serbian political establishment, this kind of a proposal is exactly what they would like to hear. They are all about economic integration. They're all about getting all the economic and financial benefits of EU membership without actually having to conduct the reforms and without actually having to obey by the rules of this EU club. And as much as I am aware that these values and democracy and rule of law are equally or similarly challenged also in some EU member states, I am afraid that if Serbia was to join the EU single market without an obligation to actually have to fulfill all the rule of law, democracy-related and other conditionalities that are required for full membership, that for the Serbian government this would be just enough. Precisely what they want, getting all the economic benefits, getting the full integration into the EU single market without actually having to go all the way and without actually having to conduct the reforms. And I don't see what would be then the trigger or the means and the mechanisms for the EU to actually require and to push not only Serbia, and I'm afraid that we might have a very similar situation in other countries of the region. Participation in the EU single market is extremely attractive. This is probably the most attractive tool that the EU has to attract the new member states, to attract these countries to reform. So I'm afraid that if the EU gives this without full membership and participation in the institutional framework and without going all the way with requiring the reforms to happen, that then it will have nothing more to offer or not enough more to offer in order to push the countries to fall into the same rules of the game as the EU member states. And on the other hand, and of course I'm aware that there are proposals, and I think that the European Stability Initiative also clarified this part of the proposal, that in addition to joining the EU single market, it would also be good for these countries to join the EU's cohesion policy and get structural and cohesion funds. This is extremely important because without that, these countries would be absolute, not absolute, but the losses from participation in the single market would be much higher in that case. So there has to be a redistribution of of resources towards the countries to a much greater extent, because so far, really, our region has been losing a lot from cooperation with the EU. We have gained a lot, but we have also lost a lot, because we have lost a lot of people. The depopulation of the region has been huge. And I'm afraid that, again, if we just become the consumers, not the citizens in the EU, that we would continue to deplete the region, and that, you know, populations of the Western Balkans would just be either cheap labor or immigrants who are, you know, quite, I would say, quite welcome, even compared to maybe immigrants from some other parts of the world in the EU countries, to do the basic jobs, the basic labor for which there is a shortage in the EU market, and that, you know, in the end, without all the positive effects that the full membership of the EU, participation in the European elections, participation in the political life of the EU, if we don't get that, if we just become consumers and source of cheap labor, I don't think that this is going to bring prosperity to the region.
There's an important point here, and this is, I think, being member of the single market requires essentially meeting conditions for membership. I mean, I know that a lot of people think, it's just the economic stuff and basically just allow them in. I think that would be a hugely ambitious process. And I would think that, you know, essentially in all the negotiation areas, and including rule of law, you cannot have the single market, the European single market cannot function without the rule of law.
And what about the common foreign and security policy? Because when we speak about enlargement nowadays, most of the time we speak about foreign policy, we speak about where we are on the, on the war, Russia's war on Ukraine, where we are on EU's foreign policy, on defense, etc. So how does then the EU, if it doesn't get the countries and if it doesn't bring the countries into its institutional structure, how is it going to keep those countries aligned? And again, I'm here mostly referring to my own country because it has been the most problematic, to say so, in this sense. How does the EU then condition Serbia to be in its ranks? And again, you know, now that we are in the middle of this bloody war, economic policy and foreign policy have become so closely, tightly intertwined. Most of the sanctions towards Russia are actually economic sanctions. And if you have a country that does not align with EU's foreign policy and with the sanctions policy towards Russia, which is participating in the EU single market, isn't that going to then hurt the EU's market and the EU's attempts to actually implement this sanctions policy? So to me, somehow it seems that because of this geopolitical situation in which we are nowadays, and because, you know, there is this huge interest, geopolitical interest in enlargement, that it is actually becoming more difficult to separate market from politics. I feel that somehow we need this political sphere, the political hat of the EU, the political hat and protection of the EU institutions, of the EU treaty framework, even more than maybe it was the case 10 years or 20 years ago.
Yes, or ideally, let's say. But when you look at the situation now, you know, the fact that Orban sits at the table does not make his policies more aligned with ours. And I think, I mean, I would be very...
But we don't know what Orban would be like if the Hungary was not in the EU.
This is true. But I think that when we look closely, I mean, common foreign policy is rather a weakness of the European Union, no? We have not really been strong on this. You can go back to Iraq. We don't have, you know, and we have enough member states who still think that they have to have their own foreign policies. I mean, I see your issue of saying, okay, if this goes too far, what do we do? But I think this problem we have, and I mean, what I also would somehow hope is that if you have a country in the Western Balkans who run through all these processes, it would get out of it pretty transformed. Otherwise, I don't see membership also in the single market possible. You know, Serbia with its current rule of law structures, forget it. Serbia will never be part neither of the European Union nor of the single market with the current structures we have.
But
I think we need this transformation, and then, I mean, there will still be challenges, and we have, how to say, as you said that before, I mean, democracy is fragile, also in the old and in the established democracies. So this is always a challenge. It's not, once you become a member of the European Union, your democracy is safe and nothing can happen. It's not like this as we see in.
But I would still argue that participation in the political life of the EU and in the work of the EU institutions would rather support the democratic processes in our region. And without us being in those political processes and political institutions, that it would be much more difficult to actually protect and defend democracy and work towards a more democratic region.
Even if I think I fully agree. And I think what we both would most like is to have a serious, honest accession process like 20 years ago, then we would not have this discussion here now. But I think my fear is this: either we have an idea where we have something which we can offer honestly, where we can get all the EU member states behind, and then, maybe at a few years later we get basically around and also solve these other issues and these countries can become members, rather than now insist on only membership and we will be stuck for another 10 years in the situation we are now.
If the EU comes out and actually has the boldness and the honesty and to say that and to clearly say, okay, full participation in the EU institutions and full EU membership is not possible in the next foreseeable future, like you mentioned before.
We cannot promise. I think that's what they should say.
We cannot promise.
They should not rule
Then
it out.
Then fine. Let's see and let's find a way how we can, take what we can and take what is possible. And definitely, I mean, having the single market at least would be some sort of a consolation prize. But I think that maybe what we haven't done is to explore all the other avenues and legal avenues and possibilities to integrate the countries in a more gradual way into the work of the institutions. The accession treaties which the countries sign with the EU member states at the moment of accession are extremely powerful legal tools, and they are actually of the same legal standing as the founding treaties of the EU. So they can even they can adjust EU treaties in relation to the accession of that specific country into the EU. So, we have had in the previous accessions various transitional periods, temporary derogations of some membership rights, transitional periods on both sides, because, simply going from a non-member to an EU member is a huge change for the economy, for politics, for the whole system, for the whole society. So finding a more gradual approach can definitely be a good idea. So why not look at the legal possibilities and find ways to integrate countries using these legal instruments which we have at hand, but using them in a more creative way? Finding ways to use longer and more comprehensive transitional periods. Having countries, even this is something which we proposed a couple of years back, and it has been a widely contested, debated, discussed idea to have countries maybe even join without having veto rights in the Council. So countries new member states would participate in the work of all the institutions. They would be able to vote on all qualified majority decisions. They would be able to participate in the construction of the consensus. They would learn how to operate inside of the EU. Citizens would become European citizens. We would be able to stand in EU elections. I would be able one day to vote in EU elections or stand in EU elections, fight for the European future of my country. But my representatives for a certain period of time would not be able to block EU's decisions. This is one of the possibilities. Also, there are so-called safeguard clauses which can protect the EU from backsliding in the new member states after the accession. In the past, they were only valid for 3 years after accession. We can extend them. We can have them last much longer. So, offering membership, but with some minuses and some exceptions which would over time expire and which would over time lead us into full equal membership with all other member states would maybe be a lesser evil in this case.
If it just made, it has been super interesting. I've never been as silent in a podcast as I've been until today, but I do think it's very, very important because what you mentioned, Milena, is actually that all good options would be on the table. The problem is, and this is what I get from the discussion, is what you see is how does it look in reality? Does the European Union, is it ready actually to deliver on all those issues which you mentioned, which I think are totally logical and would actually help to make the European Union something like an actor, and a geopolitical actor, maybe even as it was to be called in the last commission by the last after the last elections. So I do think that that this is a very important debate in this sense. And it leads me also to my next question, because I only have 2 more questions, because we are having upcoming elections in the European Parliament, and what we are seeing from the polls is that we are going to see a shift towards more radical, more right-wing parties. This is going to be a fact, although it's going to be in the Parliament. But nevertheless, do you think that this also then acts on the European Union or limits the possibilities of the European Union to act credibly even more in the future? That would be my first question. And I already put the second question there as well, is if we consider at the European Union's history, we do see, and we are very proudly always refer to it, is that the European Union has actually been a force for peace, at least for countries who have been within this circle of friends, as we call it. So maybe you can just explore a little bit on those 2 questions, like what can we expect from the next elections? What does this actually mean for the enlargement politics, also with regard to the other 3 countries we didn't really mention right now too much, which is obviously Georgia, Moldova and Ukraine, who have many, many hopes into the future European Union accession. And many of them might not be that aware about all the difficulties the other countries have been facing, and we didn't speak even about Turkey at this moment. So 2 questions. Who would like to start?
Well, maybe I can say a few words about the question of whether the EU is really a driver of peace. And this is definitely the way we perceive it in the Western Balkan region. I always argue, and well, most of my colleagues with whom I discuss about these issues, we agree that if the EU were to offer, if it were capable of offering a truly credible medium-term membership perspective to both Serbia and Kosovo, that the process of the dialogue and normalization of the relations between the 2 countries would be greatly facilitated. Of course, we cannot guarantee, because in the end, both the Prime Minister of Kosovo and the Serbian President would have to somehow, get out of their very comfortable positions in which they are right now. No credible perspective, no real promise from the EU, and without this motivation, they feel very complacent in their current positions. But if they were put on the spot by the EU, if the EU were able to offer such a credible membership perspective, unequivocally, I think that their current positions would become extremely difficult, and that internal political actors would have a much easier time challenging their positions. Right now, the Serbian opposition is either more radical or more conservative on the issue of normalization of relations with Kosovo, or on a very similar position with Vučić. We don't have a pro-European opposition party which is more vocal on the need to normalize relations with Kosovo, or to, for example, even recognize Kosovo. We don't have those societal voices. But if the EU were to offer such a perspective to Serbia, I think that the internal political dynamics in the country would change. And I would dare to say that probably that would be the case in Kosovo too. Right now, Kosovo doesn't have any real perspective for EU membership, not even for getting into the process of accession negotiations, because of the 5 non-recognizers inside of the EU. So the process is stalling. And the peace which we have in the region right now, especially between Serbia and Kosovo, is extremely fragile. We had clear evidence of that last year with the Banjska incident, and constant hate speech, inflammatory rhetoric on both sides. Instead of going towards reconciliation, we are just getting more and more and more divided. So I think that really the EU is a driver of peace, but it actually needs to be there. We need to be in the EU to feel those effects.
Okay, very quickly, I think on the Parliament, on the European Parliament, I think yes, the strong likelihood that it would shift further to the right, but I don't think that this is to an extent that it would, seriously hamper kind of the dealings of the European Union at this stage. I'm much more concerned for more EU member states shifting to the right and to the far right. I think this would create really serious problems in the mid and longer term. And on the force for peace, yes, the European Union or the communities did not start only as a peace process, but I think the further the integration actually became, the stronger this becomes. Now, the borders virtually disappearing between, Germany and France. And just imagine this in the Western Balkans, where kind of, as a Serb from Kosovo, you are free to live, in Serbia, in Macedonia. You can work, you can live in the other, you can cross very easily, no checks. You pay in the same currency. You can study wherever you want. I think this would dramatically actually shift and made a huge contribution to peace or stabilization and peace in the Western Balkans as well. And I think even in this situation where we have difficulties, or where the European Union has difficulties to establish a credible perspective for full European membership, I think it would be very worth exploring if the European Union should not offer membership in Schengen for the Western Balkan countries. Once Romania and Bulgaria actually join, there's no point of having the Western Balkans outside. And it's also a tool where you can establish a lot of, you need to actually do quite a lot in order to be eligible to become Schengen. So it would push reforms, it would strengthen reformers. And I think that would be actually a very, very tangible contribution to peace. It would also help the European Union to regain some credibility, and actually by, I think what you also said before, by having a credible perspective, be it for Schengen or be it for single market or be it for full membership, this is when you strengthen reformers in these countries, Yeah. And by basically having no credible perspective, when you now as a Serbian politician, raise your hand and say we should actually work hard to become members of the European Union, you are laughed at, And there's a reason, because it's just not very serious. So for this, I think the European Union also could make an important contribution in this respect.
Thank you so much, Kristof. Thank you so much, Milena. I found it extremely interesting. So many different topics you managed to address in 40 minutes. I do think there's still a long way to go, but you clearly mentioned also there are proposals on the table which could work. And you also said that we also need to be honest. And I do think this is also very important to also regain part of our credibility, because if we're not honest, we're actually pushing also the people away from the European Union. And we do think enlargement should be on the agenda. Enlargement will be on the agenda. It is more necessary than it has been maybe also recently, considering what is going on in the world. Both of you mentioned it. Thank you so much. It was very interesting for me, and I hope everyone learned a lot as well.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
This was the 18th episode of the podcast Peace Matters. I hope you found the discussion interesting, and please stay tuned in order not to miss our other episodes, which are also going to deal with the European elections upcoming in June.